Apple is reportedly preparing a major camera leap for the iPhone 18 Pro lineup by introducing a variable aperture system, a feature that would change how the iPhone camera behaves in different lighting conditions. Unlike recent iPhones that rely on a fixed aperture and then compensate mostly through computational photography, a variable aperture lens can physically open wider or close down depending on the scene. In practical terms, that means the camera could let in more light at night or indoors by widening the aperture, helping reduce noise and improve clarity. While in bright daylight, it could narrow the aperture to control exposure more naturally and potentially improve sharpness across the frame. It's the kind of hardware change that can make photos look more optical and less dependent on heavy processing, especially in tricky mixed light scenarios where phones sometimes struggle. However, this upgrade may come with a serious cost consequence. Supply chain analyst Ming-Chi Kuo suggests that the new camera module could cost Apple roughly 50% more to produce than the current Pro camera systems. That's a massive jump for a component that already represents one of the most expensive parts of a flagship smartphone. When a single subsystem becomes significantly more expensive, it creates a ripple effect across manufacturing budgets, margins, and long-term pricing strategy. For Apple, the question becomes less about whether the feature is impressive, because it likely is, and more about how the company wants to manage the financial impact without disrupting its carefully maintained pricing ladder across the iPhone range. This sets up a real dilemma. Apple can either absorb the additional production costs or pass them on to customers. Absorbing the cost would protect consumers from a noticeable price increase, but it could squeeze profit margins, especially if other components also become more expensive in the same generation. On the other hand, raising the retail price risks backlash, particularly in a market where buyers are already questioning how much more they should pay for incremental upgrades. If Apple does choose to increase pricing, it will need a clear headline feature to justify it, and a variable aperture camera could be exactly the kind of big, easy-to-explain upgrade that marketing can lean on. What makes this even more important is that early leaks point toward minimal external design changes for the iPhone 18 Pro. If the phone looks nearly identical to the previous generation, Apple will have fewer visual cues to signal a big upgrade. In those years, the burden usually shifts to internal features, especially cameras, to give people a strong reason to upgrade. For many users, the camera is already the #1 reason to buy a Pro model, so Apple doubling down on camera hardware makes sense. But it also raises expectations. If the design stays familiar, people will expect the camera improvements to be immediately noticeable in everyday use, not just in side-by-side comparisons or niche situations. Another key detail suggesting this is moving beyond the rumor stage is the claim that Sunny Optical, a major Chinese optic supplier, is already preparing production for these next-generation lenses. When suppliers begin ramping planning and tooling for a new lens system, it usually indicates the technology is progressing through the supply chain pipeline rather than sitting as a lab experiment. Of course, plans can still change, but supplier preparation typically aligns with serious intent, especially for a feature that would require precise manufacturing and strict quality control at Apple's scale. This potential shift also fits into a broader industry direction. Samsung is rumored to be exploring a return to variable aperture technology for a future flagship like the Galaxy S27 Ultra. Variable aperture isn't entirely new to smartphones. Some older devices experimented with it, but bringing it back at the highest end of the market could signal that manufacturers believe the benefits are worth the complexity again. If both Apple and Samsung push variable aperture into their top-tier models, it could quickly become a new battleground feature, similar to how periscope zoom, large sensors, and advanced stabilization became must-have specs over the past few years. Looking further ahead, reports suggest Apple is also thinking long-term about camera architecture beyond the iPhone 18 cycle. One claim points to a more radical redesign of the ultra-wide camera around 2028 using an onboard chip design. The idea behind this kind of integration is to save internal space, something that is increasingly valuable as phones try to balance larger batteries, improved thermal management, and more complex camera systems, all within the same thin chassis. If Apple can reduce the footprint of camera components or their supporting electronics, it could free room for a bigger battery, better heat dissipation for sustained performance, or additional hardware features without making the phone thicker. Overall, the iPhone 18 Pro story, based on these reports, sounds less like a design revolution and more like a camera-driven strategy. Keep the external look familiar while delivering a meaningful hardware upgrade where users care most. The catch is that a 50% cost increase in the camera module is not a small detail. It's the kind of jump that forces difficult decisions and may shape how Apple prices and positions the entire Pro lineup. If the variable aperture system delivers clearly better low-light performance, more natural exposure control, and a more professional-looking depth and sharpness profile, Apple could frame it as the main reason to upgrade. But if the improvements feel subtle, the conversation could quickly shift from major camera breakthrough to why is it more expensive? And that's the risk Apple will need to manage if these reports turn out to be accurate.